I'm delighted to welcome all of you. It's great to see such a wonderful turnout. My name is Martha Kennedy. I'm a curator of popular graphic art in the Prints and Photographs Division here at the Library of Congress. Today's program is sponsored by the Swann Foundation and the Prints and Photographs Division. And it is my honor to introduce our speaker today. But before I do that, just a few words about the Swann Foundation. It is one of the few that supports scholarly graduate research in the field of caricature and cartoon through annually awarded fellowships. Since 1977, it's been an important part of the library's graphic arts programs. The foundation underwrites programs and projects like preservation and processing of the library's original comic art, development of these collections, related programming, and many exhibitions in the Graphic Arts Gallery and the exhibit spaces in the library's Thomas Jefferson building. In fact, there are some up right now. This event is being videotaped for future broadcast on the library's website and other media. We encourage you to ask questions and offer comments after the talk. If you participate in the Q&A, please realize that you are consenting to the library possibly using your filmed image and remarks. Today's speaker, Joshua A. Kopin, is a PhD candidate in the Department of American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. His dissertation deals with the relationship between technology and the development of comics in the 19th century, by approaching a single strip from R.F. Outcault's Hogan's Alley. He has writings published or forthcoming in American Literature and Inks, as well as an entry in the upcoming Keywords for Comic Studies volume. He's a member at large on the board of the International Comic Arts Forum and the president of the Graduate Student Caucus of the Comic Studies Society. He also recently gave a fascinating paper related to his dissertation at a conference entitled Illustration Across Media, 19th Century to Now, that was hosted by Washington University in St. Louis, and I was lucky to get to hear it. It has been a pleasure to introduce Josh to some of the resources that relate to his research in the Prints and Photographs Division and other divisions here at the library. His lecture today is titled Comics in the 19th Century, in 19th Century Time and Space. Please help me welcome Joshua.
Before I begin, I would like to thank the Carolyn and Irwin Swann Foundation for giving me the opportunity to come to the Library of Congress to do all this research. I spent 2 weeks here in the fall, and I'm about to spend 2 more weeks here now, and it is an extraordinary opportunity, and I'm very pleased that I have been able to do it. I'd also like to thank Travis Hensley and the folks in the Kluge Center for allowing me use of a desk space there. That has made my stay here a lot more productive and comfortable than having to sort of run around from reading room to reading room might have made it. And finally, I want to thank the staff of the Prints and Photographs Division of the Library of Congress, who have been incredibly and enormously helpful, and I am incredibly grateful for their guidance in showing me what the library has, the many treasures that the library has. And in particular, I'm grateful to Martha Kennedy for being my primary guide and my advisor in this process. I sure can. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for saying something about that. I also, is that good? That better?
The microphone.
Oh.
I'm gonna make it louder.
Okay. I would also like to acknowledge that this is very much a work in progress, so I'm very excited to hear what kinds of comments and questions that you may have for me. I'm about a year out from handing in this dissertation, so there's a lot of time left to make changes. Okay. In an article from this past January entitled, "Do I Hate the 9-Panel Grid?" or "Do I Just Resent Watchmen?", comics critic Claire Napier goes after the 3-panel by 3-panel page layout that is sometimes described as comics' most powerful compositional strategy. What bothers me, she writes, is the sense of being told to. Someone is telling me this is happening specifically like this. I am being asked to sit still with my hands in my lap while the teacher talks. A month later, in the magazine Wired, Peter Rubin celebrated a different, squarer grid format. Writing about the sudden, explosive popularity of cartoonist Nathan Pyle's Strange Planet strip, Rubin notes that the 2x2 grid takes its cue from early 20th century comics like Mutt and Jeff, and suggests, drawing on examples not only from Pyle but also from many others, that the 2x2 grid's current resurgence has to do with the easy readability of four panels organized in two tiers on a scrolling smartphone screen. Unlike the one panel by four panel grid that is more familiar to us from the long legacy of contemporary style funny page strips, which, when encountered on Facebook or Twitter, force you to stop scrolling and really read or, God forbid, click through to a bigger image, the 2x2 grid is so well suited to cell phone social media because a reader can just keep going even as they read. The regular grid, in any format, has a long and vital history in comics, stretching back to the 19th century or, depending on your definition of comics, perhaps even earlier. As Napier points out, the 3x3 grid has, since at least the invention of the contemporary comic book at the end of the 1930s, been one of the key formats of American comics, and is often considered the base layout in American comic books. With that said, however, the 3x3 grid is more of an assumption than a truly standard practice, easy for a cartoonist to fall back on when needed, but especially powerful when used well. In the Franco-Belgian bande dessinée tradition, think Tintin, but not just Tintin, the regular grid, quite charmingly called the waffle iron, is of similar importance and actually appears with a greater frequency. As all these examples suggest, the regular grid is an important, perhaps the most important, formal feature of comics from across the globe. However, it's important to remember that the grid, regular or not, has not always necessarily meant comics, and indeed does not necessarily mean so now. In fact, as comics developed across the 19th century, there were a whole host of sequential and juxtaposed forms, many of which utilized regular grids, which are nonetheless not comics. They may look the same, but they don't necessarily arise out of the same questions and concerns, and to call them such means misunderstanding their various complementary goals. In our times, it is tempting, even common, to look at a grid and say, hey, look, comics. This impulse has led to a kind of imperialism within comics historiography that looks at images placed in regular or even irregular grids or sequences produced in other places and times, and folds them into the history of comics, imagining a long and capacious evolution of the form that integrates cave paintings, tapestries, various kinds of religious art, quilts, and so on. These things are important to the development of this comic strip, and they have important formal relationships to comics, but they are their own objects, with their own historical, cultural, and production contexts, and their own strategies for showing thinking and making meaning. Closely examining these relationships and considering how the difference between forms operate is something that has been lost in the excitement of finding increasingly early examples. And to fully understand comics, both historically and theoretically, we must take this problem up. This talk juxtaposes late 19th century comics, the comics that today we understand as comics, with earlier 19th century examples that are equally legitimate and valuable, that look similar but which answer different questions and articulate different kinds of concerns. Comic scholar Colin Beinecke has coined the term comicity to argue that we can read not comics objects as if they were comics, or, if you prefer, that we can apply comics theory to them, opening up important avenues of investigation that are not otherwise available to scholars writing criticism of painting, photography, sculpture, literature, cinema, and so on. Take, for example, German pop artist Gerhard Richter's color chart experiments, which he began in the late 1960s. These paintings are grids of colors, which Richter attempted to lay out more or less randomly. A traditional art historical perspective on these grids might consider the compositions as wholes, or might even self-consciously ignore them, in order to elucidate Richter's destabilization of painterly practice and aesthetic standards. A comicitist reading, meanwhile, would take into account the composition of the piece as a whole, and the philosophy under which it was made. But it also recognizes that a narrative, however abstract, was brought into being when Richter placed one colored square after the other. Comicity is an important idea because it allows us new perspectives for understanding, for example, abstract artist Agnes Martin's Many Happy Grids, my favorites, which take pains to emphasize structure over content, and therefore are in turn a useful theoretical touchstone for thinking structure in comics, and because it exposes certain expectations, or perhaps we could call them prejudices, about what comics are and what they are not. Is this Richter, for example, as obviously comicitous as the first one that we saw? Even more importantly, however, comicity suggests an important gap in the way that comic scholarship thinks and writes about its objects. For historical reasons, a foundational idea in comic studies is that comics are a medium and not a genre. That is to say that comics are formal objects that are capable of taking on more subjects than just superheroes. This perspective, however, limits the notion of genre to certain kinds of narratological categories. If we instead take genre to mean, quote, a series of expectations that an individual brings to a text and a strategy of approach that a knowledgeable individual applies to that text, and we consider that these expectations and strategies might be just as applicable to images as they are to literal, that is to say printed or written, text, then we can understand that comics are both medium and genre, that they are both formal objects and the approach that readers are supposed to take to those objects, suggested to readers by form, yes, but also by paratext and cultural context and perhaps a dozen other things. My dissertation, titled The Grid, the Kid, His Phonograph, and His Friends, argues that comics as medium and comics as a genre developed in parallel and emerged together in fits and starts across the 19th century. It argues that one could not exist without the other, but it also suggests that they are not the same, that they can be disarticulated from one another, that the comics medium is a kind of 19th century technology of time and space that exists in the context not only of developments in the histories of illustration and the press, but also of science and engineering, both as subjects of inquiry in their own right and as applied to entertainment, and that the comics genre represents an epistemology, an understanding of time and space that is the result of just how quickly those ways of being in the world were altered in that moment. In order to make this argument, I've turned to cartoonist R.F. Occult and his most famous creation, the comic strip character that started it all, or at least maybe started it all, or maybe certainly didn't start it all, depending on who you ask. That is to say, the world-famous Yellow Kid, whose adventures were chronicled in a series of three separate strips for the New York World and the New York Journal American at the end of the 1890s. My dissertation proceeds from a single Occult strip, The Yellow Kid and His New Phonograph, published by Joseph Pulitzer's New York World on October 25th, 1896. Of course, broadly, my dissertation is about a lot of things. It's about Taylorism and sound recording and Jacob Riis and Chinese exclusion and Irish immigration and the Spanish-American War and some other stuff too. Narrowly though, and for today, my dissertation is about this one comic strip, which acts as a matrix of ways to think of the comic strip as a kind of 19th century technology that incorporates and responds to a whole slew of other contemporary technologies and media. As Stephen Kern writes in the first pages of The Culture in Time and Space, 1880 to 1918, from around 1880 to the outbreak of World War I, a series of sweeping changes in technology and culture created distinctive new modes of thinking about and experiencing time and space. Technological innovations including the telephone, wireless telegraph, X-ray, cinema, bicycle, automobile, and airplane established the material foundation for this reorientation. The result was a transformation of the dimensions of life and thought. Kern's analysis proceeds on the premise that independent cultural developments shaped consciousness directly, but it seems extraordinarily unlikely that we can separate technological innovation from cultural innovation. The two sets of developments can only be properly understood if conceived of as in dialogue. That is, if notions of consciousness set the limits of the possible, while technology and culture are determined by those limits, strain against them, and imagine how things could be otherwise. It is important to note, therefore, that each of the technological that Kern cites serves as a kind of prosthetic, an inorganic extension of the human body that allows it to operate outside of its normal capacities. the automobile and the bicycle annihilate space and time, with the latter having the extra advantage of being an actual extension of the body, just as the train had half a century before, while X-rays allowed for the seeing of matter hidden behind other matter, and the telephone allowed for the transmission of the human voice over much longer distances than a shout. Film, as it emerged out of photography, similarly functioned as a prosthetic for memory and conceptions of time, allowing humans to actually replay over and over the exact motion of a body as captured on emulsion, making time travel both possible and accessible. These technologies obliterated the limits of the past, making human bodies greater and more efficient than they ever had been. They opened up the world. By taking all of these technologies and remixing them, the 19th century comic strip sought to reproduce the experience of a whole new way of being, both wide open and increasingly atomized. Instead of merely representing this experience, however, the comic strip marshaled it to affect affects, such that it can be said that it was both formed by and formed the world around it, in particular ways that emphasized the new speed of time and the new claustrophobia of space, by caricaturing them, the same way that images in the comic strip characters individuals, types, and people. As a medium and a genre coalescing at the end of the 19th century, in the United States that was changing very rapidly, the comic strip caricatured social experience in a way that proved very powerful for its very early readers and remains very powerful for us today. These important formal and generic innovations recognize the ties that early comic strips have to political cartoons and other forms of graphic satire, while installing them within a technological lineage from which they are usually excluded. In order to use the technology of caricature to replicate, via the grid, the experience of the new time and space, and to imagine how else time and space might change, the comic strip places images in order in such a way that they develop harmony and dissonance with each other and with compositional wholes, what comic scholar Leah Meismer calls the tension between sequence and simultaneity. Strips, in other words, allow a reader to experience time and space linearly, antilinearly, and in a way that sometimes casts us far back into the past or far forward into the future, or which sometimes moves us in space but not time, or in time but not space. The comic strip is therefore a technology, comics as medium, that encapsulate a particular epistemology, comics as genre, and a very distinctly 19th century one, although we might actually call it pre-digital rather than mechanical. In order to explore this constellation of technologies and media that emerged in the 19th century and that were appropriated and remixed into what we call the comic strip, I have divided my project into 4 chapters: the grid, the kid, his phonograph, and his friends. The grid, from which most of this talk is drawn, focuses on 19th century technology, performance, and media forms that made the world that comics emerged with and out of. Cinema is not the least of these, of course, but we must also consider city grids, photographic motion studies, moving panoramas, stereoscopes, and other kinds of forms. The kid focuses on the political and media context that allowed the yellow kid to take the form that shaped him, and that he shaped in return. It's about political cartoons, and about imperialism, and about exclusion and immigration. His phonograph begins with a historical coincidence that the Yellow Kid's creator, R.F. Occult, worked for Thomas Alva Edison doing mechanical drawings and building exposition displays in the 1880s and the 1890s, that is, as Edison was inventing American cinema, and considers how a captioning and labeling strategy, sometimes called the banderole or the phylactery, from religious art and early graphic satire comes in the 1890s to represent sound with the technology that we now know as the word balloon. Finally, the 4th chapter, that's the phonograph stuff. Finally, the 4th chapter, His Friends, considers how the kid and the comic strip both utilized and influenced notions of childhood, which were undergoing significant revision in this moment, coming to be understood as a special time, separated from adulthood by the newly minted idea of adolescence, and also inflected by class, race, and other concerns. And the only one of the kid's friends in this strip is the bird, but he is a friend. Although sometimes called the first comic strip because of its combination of images and sequence, the grid, a star character, the kid, and a new iteration of the old illustration strategy that we now call the word balloon, his phonograph, I turn to the Yellow Kid and his new phonograph not because it represents the first instance of a new form, but precisely because it does not. Because I don't believe we can identify any such first. Instead of understanding comics as something that emerged, fully formed, out of the hand of one cartoonist or another. I think it is more useful to see them as having developed in fits and starts over the course of the whole 19th century. The Yellow Kid in his new phonograph, therefore, captures the comic as medium and the comic as a genre as they were ascendant, nearly but not quite fully formed in the way that we understand them today. It has many of the features that are essential to comics, but it also demonstrates the experimentation with images in sequence that was characteristic in illustration before the ossification of both the comics medium and the comics genre at the end of the 19th century. It contained traces of all those experiments, and it is those experiments that we will explore today. Before I show you some examples, though, here is a methodological note. Inspired by the critic Heather Love, one of the interventions of my project is to suggest that description is, on its own, an important mode of inquiry when studying sequential and multimodal visual materials in general and comics in particular. Since meaning arises in comics from the connection and tensions between images, and because those relationships are enforced less strongly than, for example, they are in cinema, thickly describing them is essential for proper understanding of them. If this seems squishy and postmodern, that's because it is. Although objectivity is never compelling, even in more static and authoritarian media, comics' dependence on readers to draw connections between images forefronts the role of subjectivity in their interpretation. And one of the means we have to take in the difference between the images we organize by grids that want to be read as comics and images organized by grids that desire other ways of reading, understanding how different cartoonists across the 19th century treated relationships between images is one of the keys to developing a better understanding of the historical evolution of sequential illustration up through the comic strip. The collections of the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division are filled with drawings that can show you what I mean. The examples that follow are just some of the many treasures that I've been lucky to encounter with the guidance and support of Martha Kennedy and the rest of the PNP staff, to whom I am eternally grateful. Not every image that I'm about to share comes from PNP, although most of them do, and I have distinguished the ones from the library with the ones I've pulled from other places by noting the call numbers for the PNP materials. The relevant materials begin in the Library of Congress of Collections with Finn's Comic Sketchbook, published in New York, probably sometime in the 1830s, by a cartoonist named Henry James Finn. Finn's is particularly interesting for our purposes because right there, if you look right there, it says the word comics. Actually, it says the word comic, but it's easy to understand how it might be exciting for a scholar of 19th century comic strips to be excited by this discovery. Okay? And particularly in the context of the fact that comics has come to mean something other than comic for us, right? With the ascendancy of the graphic novel and the sort of cultural devaluing of the comic strip, sort of humor as an element in the comics form no longer has the primacy of place that it had for much of the 20th century, and indeed for much of the 19th century. This temptation even gets more intense when you look at the leaves of the book and you find what is more or less a 3x3 panel grid, if a particularly irregular one. You can see that one of them is sort of like stuffed in between those two cartoons on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side. Finn's pages are large, perhaps a foot high and a couple feet across, and horizontally oriented. Each page is made up of a few cartoons. There are 9 here, none of which is particularly funny, at least to my taste, and many of which are some variety of racist or sexist. Although the number of cartoons varies in each, they are always squished onto the page so as to leave as little blank space as possible. They don't appear to be related to each other by any particular principle or joke, nor is there any hint of what sometimes gets called progressive action, as when Spider-Man swings from web to web, panel to panel, over New York City. The order obfuscates a commiserative reading, and yet the general grid pattern is clear and repeats across the book's 4 leaves. Finn's is part of a genre of cartoons juxtaposed with each other on a single page that you often see in the 19th century, perhaps best represented by the cartoons of Englishman George Cruikshank, seen here. Taken from Cruikshank's Omnibus, a combination of graphic satire and prose humor originally published in 9 parts, the Library of Congress copy is held, like Finn's comic sketchbook, in the Prints and Photographs case collection. Cruikshank's illustrations in the omnibus superficially resemble Finn's sketches in that they are juxtaposed with each other in such a way that seems designed to leave as little negative space on the page as possible. Unlike Finn's, however, Cruikshank is working with pages that are taller than they are wide, and which were published in a more traditional book size and format. The cartoon pages in the omnibus are further distinguished by their relatively greater level of visual chaos, containing the same number of objects packed into a much smaller space, without a single clue about how to read the images. Even though they lack visual order, however, the omnibus cartoons are given thematic order by a caption, often related to the news and politics of the day, and found at the bottom of each page. The cartoons are thus structured by an unusually strong word and image relationship, Cruikshank riffing on the same theme over and over and over again, a joke in many parts, with just the one punchline. At the same time as Finn was working and Cruikshank was cartooning, the Swiss illustrator Rudolf Topfer was toiling away at his own multiple image pages. Although this example is from Brutus Calicot, a work left unfinished at the time of his death in 1846, Topfer began publishing picture stories organized in grids, featuring progressive action and containing complex word and image relationships in the early 1830s. And I should say that Topfer is actually represented in the case collection, although I haven't had the chance to look at the materials there yet, and I'm very much looking forward to the opportunity to do so this week or next. His books were circulated in translation across Europe and in the United States in the late 1830s and early 1840s, and he is therefore sometimes called the first comics artist, and he is credited with having published the first comic books. Topfer was certainly working in a new form, and there are nearly identical similarities between his work and what we now call comics. They proceeded in an orderly fashion from left to right, and then top to bottom, and indeed they appear to be meant to be read in that order. The variety of graphical formats featuring multiple images related to each other by varying degrees of strength appearing in Europe and the United States at this time, and the fact that Topfer's principles of progressive action were not taken up again in quite the same way until nearly half a century later, despite the wide circulation of his works, suggests, at least to me, that it is necessary to view him as more anticipating the comics to come rather than as the genesis of them. We can see this, for example, because just as Cruikshank influenced Topfer, the latter's preference for organizing his illustration in grids, necessitated by his use of progressive action, appears at least once in Cruikshank's later works. So this is a comic strip, right? Looks an awful lot like a comic strip. This example, from a few years after Topfer's death, superficially resembles his grids, but Cruikshank's ordering is obfuscated by the placement of the guiding theme, the preparatory school for fast men, at the bottom of the image, like in the earlier Cruikshank illustration. This means that the visual clues that would suggest to a reader that they approach Cruikshank's image as they might one of Topfer's are confused by cues that guide the eye to the larger block of text at the bottom before forcing it up to the start of the strip at the top. This kind of strong image-text relationship suggests the chaos of Cruikshank's earlier cartoons more than the order of Topfer's pages. Indeed, if you follow the action of the apparent strip, you can see that the only panel that requires a fixed position to make sense is the final one, the finishing department, and that each of the others could be reordered without significant alteration to the meaning of the piece. The preparatory school for fast men is therefore somewhere in between the image story and the multi-image cartoon. It is the comic as medium with an incomplete application of the comic as a genre, an experiment, in other words, just like Topfer's, that demonstrates the complicated and multivalent landscape of relationships between images as mediated by grids within a single work in the first half of the 19th century. Looking at Topfer's grids and at Cruikshank's, we can see a variety of possible influences outside of the world of illustration. To my eyes, among the most compelling is the magic lantern. Invented in the 17th century, magic lanterns project images onto surface via light. If you look at magic lantern slides, like the ones pictured at the top and to the bottom left here, you can see that they often utilized innovative strategies to depict motion, illusions that showed moving eyes or the rotation of the planets, achieved with levers, cranks, and masks. Sometimes they showed movement that occurs across 3 or 4 slides on a single plate, like the image at the top. meant to be viewed one right after another by passing the plate across the light source. These became increasingly common as the 19th century progressed, and we can see them, for example, in Ingmar Bergman's film Fanny and Alexander, a still from which is at the bottom left, which is set at the end of the 19th century, at the very precipice of both comics and cinema. Although capturing motion via photography was a few decades off yet, it was still possible in the time of Finn, Topfer, and Cruikshank to see images move. Despite the creation and painting of movable magic lantern slides, itself a form of illustration, the appearance of motion within graphic works on paper was still appearing in fits and starts throughout the middle of the 19th century. Although it was certainly possible, as Topfer demonstrates, it was not yet common, which suggests that the cultural conditions framed by quickly changing technologies like the railroad that were in turn altering traditional relationships between individuals and their place in time and space, were not yet right for motion to regularly appear on paper, organized and explained by the grid. Indeed, just as sequential magic lantern slides proliferated as the 19th century marched forward, sequential images that required narrative to operate on paper did too. Increasingly complicated experiments with sequence and grids that appeared in the pages of the pictorial press in the United States and in England, like this Thomas Nast example from 1860. But this example is organized not from left to right, top to bottom, but instead from top to bottom, left to right. The actions depicted in the images are often Through the end of the 1870s, gridded picture stories become quite common, especially in England, where the scheming alley sloper becomes perhaps the first great recurring character in sequential illustration. Or anyway, the first great non-religious recurring character in sequential illustration. Still, the actions depicted in the images are often set quite far apart, requiring text and paratext to string them together into a story to suggest sequence as a kind of mode of reading. At the end of the decade, however, a new application of photography appears, one that enables others to take up the practice of sequencing images through a grid as Topfer had nearly 50 years earlier. In 1878, after perfecting a method of capturing motion with photographs that he had been developing for some time, photographer Edward Muybridge embarked on a significant and wide-ranging study of animal locomotion. Although the most famous to us are his images of horses galloping, I found this goat particularly charming, Muybridge studied many different kinds of animals, including humans, and there are also some great images of athletes that he took. I like the baseball players in particular, but there's lots of them. A significant collection of these motion studies is held in the collections in P&P. The connection between Muybridge and comics has long been apparent, since the form that we most closely identify as comicitous, the regular grid, was the form that he most readily worked in. We also know that there was a clear historical connection between Muybridge's experiments and an early practitioner, perhaps the earliest practitioner, of the comics as medium. The illustrator A.B. Frost was introduced to Muybridge's work by his teacher, famous Pennsylvania painter Thomas Eakins, and quickly adapted the style of motion studies into his work. Although he was fluent in many genres of illustration, it is Frost's wordless picture stories that most interest me. He produced some novels and pictures, so an individual image on an individual page, and some four-panel grids for American magazines in the 1880s, both of which can be found in P&P. But by 1890, Frost was experimenting with this form, a 1x2 panel grid on the top tier of a magazine advertiser, so that as you were drawn forward in the strip, you were also drawn forward in the advertisements, solving a particularly thorny problem for a paper made up primarily of advertisements. Looking at Frost's grid, you can see Muybridge's influence, as well as the legacy of other motion studies photographers. They depict multiple actions happening simultaneously, often through minute changes in the positions of bodies and objects. This kind of motion capture becomes significantly more common at this moment as smaller intervals of progressive action become not only conceivable theoretically, but possible to see through the power of the photograph in sequence. The path blazed by Topfer suddenly becomes comprehensible to others, a guiding principle for how to understand time and space. It is no coincidence that comics are, by this time, ascendant, close to coalescing in the form and through the genre that we understand them today. Even so, the juxtaposed image cartoon that resisted sequence remained quite visible, even after the Yellow Kid turned the comic strip into a smash hit. In the 1880s and 1890s, Frederick Burr Opper drew many of a variety called the vignette for the magazine Puck, perhaps the most significant humor publication of the period. The vignette form improved upon Cruikshank's multi-image cartoon by adding an extra-large illustration into the mix and organizing the rest of the images into a regular grid. A reader's eyes are drawn to the big central image first, and then to the caption which clarifies them with a punchline. In this case, an original art piece drawn from the Swart collection. When they're published in Puck, they're in color, they have the caption visible on the bottom, and they're significantly smaller. But this one's nice because the lines are bright and clear, and because it allows me to show you what these things look like in general. So a reader's eyes are drawn to the big central image, and then to the caption which clarifies them with a punchline. In this case, an original art piece drawn from the Swann collection, with the punchline, or the caption, "The people's mania for getting their names into the paper," something that hasn't changed in the past 120 years. The rest of the images are supplementary riffs, adding to the joke. In general, these images are connected by the caption and the caption alone. And this vignette appears to be organized in this way, failing to provide guidance beyond the initial move to the big image, and then from it to the caption. But if you look at the top, you can see the comic strip sneaking its way in. In 1900, Opper will debut the character Happy Hooligan in a regular 2x3 panel grid, appearing in William Randolph Hearst's New York American Journal. And they will join Occult and the Yellow Kid as important early strip stars, buttressed by the possibility of publishing these grids in something that's, in 1902, called a comic book. Muybridge's influence through Frost had become unavoidable. Although cartoonists like Winsor McCay will soon take both medium and genre to new heights by experimenting with what was possible within both the comic strip. The comic strip becomes the dominant form of grid juxtaposed image illustration, rationalizing time and space just as the motion studies had. No longer emergent, the comic strip, that is to say, the comic as medium and the comic as genre both, is at this point more or less set, the 19th century technology that remains with us today. Thank you. I think I have some time for questions. Comments? Harangues? Yeah.
Thank you very much. This was really great. What a shame that you never got to really talk about the Yellow Kid, though.
Yeah.
And I have a question because I find it really intriguing that you approach the Yellow Kid in terms of the grid, because so much of it doesn't actually not make use of the grid and has this kind of tableau layout. Can you talk about this? Do you see the grid in there, or do you just ignore that part of the Yellow Kid? Or you wouldn't?
No, I mean, I hope not. I think it's very important, and so I think there are 6 grids. I think Occult draws 6 grids in something like 50 or 60 Yellow Kid illustrations, right? They're primarily published in full or half-page tableaus that start actually published as cartoon-sized, right? And then they get sort of bigger and bigger. And they become increasingly, they change a lot as they move from the Pulitzer papers to the Hearst papers. But in general, they're tableaus. And actually, in one iteration, they're illustrated text. They're not even really comic strips in the way that we understand them, or tableaus in the way that we would understand them. And I think this is important because it suggests a kind of broad base for the early comic strip. It suggests that Occult and Opper and all the people that came before them were experimenting with all these different forms. And I kind of want to call all those things comic strips. I'm not sure how far I'm going to get with that. but I kind of want to call them all comic strips because they're working out the same kind of positions and the same kind of questions as occult and opera develop in their more sort of regular grid panels. With that said, this moment is super interesting to me because it is the moment in which the comic strip becomes dominant. Those other forms, tableaus, cartoons, they don't disappear. But all of a sudden, the comic strip is one of the most important forms of illustration. It drives, it's part of what drives the circulation wars between Pulitzer and Hearst. It sort of begins to appear everywhere as you get further and further into the 20th century. And as it sort of develops into what we now call the funny pages, right, the strip form shrinks. It gets to be 4 panels. It's published in 2 different formats, the Sunday color strip and the weekday black and white strip. And so it's easy, I think, for us to look at those things and go, oh, those are comics. And this is going to sound a little funny based on what I said at the beginning of the presentation, right? I want to call as many things as possible comics, in part because I'm not sort of invested in what is or is not. But what I am invested in is like the kinds of epistemologies and the kind of questions that those illustrators were asking that led to the comic strip and that led to the sort of full emergence of the comic strip at the end of the 19th century. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Do you think the grid became more ascendant due to technology because you could take the grid and disassemble it and then reassemble it into a comic book, a big little book, advertising panels?
Yeah, absolutely. Like these Happy Hooligan cartoons, for example, were published in Hearst's papers first, and then they were reprinted into these comic books. I also think that, and so advertising is and marketing and merchandising is a big story of why the kid is so popular, right? He's one of the first figures that is accessible to the urban poor in this way. And so the kid dolls and the kid buttons and the fact that the paper was cost a penny, right? All sort of add to his popularity. But I also want to say that there's a cultural thing that's happening too, not just a technological thing, which is that the technology is becoming increasingly comprehensible and increasingly structuring people's lives. And so as the sort of grid becomes more and more important through the first 15 years or so of the 20th century, and then starts to be sort of get really sort of screwy with Winsor McCay in the teens and the 20s, right? People find the grid compelling first because it seems comfortable, and then they find the irregular grid of McCay or George Harriman comfortable because it is rejecting the thing about their lives that is making them miserable, or one of the many things about their lives that is making them miserable, which is the kind of regularity and atomization of time and space. So like we're having now, where we have all this amazing technology that makes our lives better and also makes it easier for people to spy on us. The rationalization of time in the 19th century and also the rationalization of space, right, allow people to move farther more quickly than they had ever been possible to before. But it also allowed them, it also forced them into like very specific kinds of work that were managed in very specific kinds of ways. And so the grid is a kind of ambivalent thing, and we can sort of track through the grid or with the grid the way that people were responding to these cultural and technological changes, which of course are tied together. Yeah.
You were talking about, I can't remember which of the cartoonists who was working for Edison
Mhm.
while he was making the
Mhm.
movie. Does the development of storyboards also affect their adoption of the grid?
I don't know. I don't know when storyboarding becomes a common practice within movie making practice. What I do know, and what is sort of interesting to me, is that nobody has thought about the ways that the magic lantern slide, the sequential magic lantern slide, or at least nobody as far as I know, has thought about the ways that the sequential magic lantern slide influences both comics and cinema. And the other thing that's interesting is that a lot of the people who have written about both 19th century cinema and 19th century comics have suggested that although theater is a more obvious antecedent to cinema than comics is, that the early comic strip is actually the most important influence on the way that cinema develops in the 1890s and the 1900s, and then as it becomes its own thing with Griffith. After that, sort of, it goes off in its own direction. And actually, I heard a very interesting talk this past weekend by a cartoonist who thinks that when that happened in the teens, that comics loses its own language and it becomes infected with the language of cinema, which I think is a really interesting thesis and something that's worth thinking through, especially since the early comic strip seems to be so influential in the way that early cinema was structured. Yeah.
I believe you mentioned at the beginning something about the cultural devaluation of the comic strip.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted you to expand on that a little bit.
Sure. It has to do with the cultural devaluation of the newspaper. And there's also this sort of really interesting thing that's happening within the sort of tiny field of comic studies itself, which is that there are dozens of books about Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and a few fewer books about Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, and a few books even fewer about that than about Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, which is to say there are a lot of books about the graphic novel, and there are similarly a lot of books about the superhero comic. There are very, very few studies into the history of the comic strip, which, if you look at the history of comics, seems unusual or surprising, because through the 1940s, the comic strip was the only thing that there was. There were no comic books as we understand them, right? So that's 50 years right there of comics history that we've totally haven't touched. You have a few people writing about Occult, a few people writing about McKay, a few people writing about Harriman, these sort of big figures in the field. But there are hundreds of comics cartoonists, cartoonists working specifically in the comic strip mode during this period, right? Okay, and so then the comic book is invented in the late 30s, or, the superhero comic book, the pamphlet, the vertical pamphlet, as opposed to the horizontal book that we see here, is invented in the 30s, and you get the craze in the 40s and the 50s. And then you get this sort of resurgence of superhero comics after the Comics Code in the late 50s and the early 60s. And even so, the comic strip remains a very important cultural touchstone, right? My advisor likes to tell me these stories about her whole family gathering around the page, right, the funny pages, about them trading them at Sunday morning breakfast. And this is an experience that, in part because, again, of the rise of the internet and the devaluation of American periodical print culture, that is no longer something that we think about. I don't think those two things are necessarily related. I think that the reason that one of the reasons that strips have gotten devalued is because the early comic scholarship felt like it had to argue for its place in a cultural hierarchy, and it did it through the graphic novel. Now, there are some really early guys, Thomas Inge, R.C. Harvey, who focused on the strip, but the sort of as academic comic studies developed into sort of more of a field and less of a few guys doing really great work, it lost its focus on those things, which is unfortunate, because I think of all the comics forms, the comic strip is the closest to the culture. Even in their heyday, superhero comic strips, the circulation wasn't very high. I mean, in the 40s and the 50s it was, but starting in the 60s it's not, and it's even worse now. And the graphic novel, I mean, everyone's read Mouse, right? But other than that, the circulation is certainly not very high at all. And so I think one of the great tasks of the next group of young scholars like myself is to recover strip history, is to think more broadly about Occult and Harriman and McKay and Opper and the guys who get a little more play, like Schultz, of course, and Watterson, but also about all those strips that you remember, but you don't remember the name of the cartoonist, or you don't remember the names of any of the characters, Sherman's Lagoon and stuff like that. There's a whole wide open space out there. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Is there anyone who hasn't asked a question yet? Yeah.
I'm kind of curious to see what you think about the sort of progression from the physical strip and the publication in newsprint to the publication now of webcomics and online serialized materials, and how you think that might play a role in future scholarship or in the field of comics studies.
Webcomics are amazing because they massively expand what is possible. If you think about some of the things that Randall Munroe has done with XKCD with these sort of infinite scrolling panels, or the cartoonist Jeff Jacques, who is a cartoonist that I've been reading since I was 13, which means that I've been reading him for more than half of my lifespan, who sometimes uses GIFs. The publication of cartoons on the web has significantly expanded their reach, particularly as newspaper circulation has decreased. But it has also massively grown the things that are possible. And it's one of the things that suggests to me that it's important to look at the tableau, for example, as a kind of comic strip. It's one of the things that's important to me. It's one of the reasons that's suggested to me that we need to not only look at form, but also at epistemology, at ways of understanding of the world that are built into the form as we understand it. So it's one of the reasons why I want to make a distinction between comics as medium and comics as a genre, because I think as soon as you start getting into that stuff like the infinite scrolling grid, form people get kind of wiggy. But I think it's important that we think about those things as comics, as addressing the same kinds of concerns about time and space. And one of the things that I also want to say, and I'm not sure I made this clear in the talk, is that I believe that the comic strip is a very specifically 19th century technology. I believe that it has the same kind of 19th century concerns that we have now. And one of the reasons that it's interesting is that it persists for historical reasons, even though the concerns that it has, we're well past them. Like, things move so much faster now, and comics haven't sped up until you start putting cinema in them, like until they start to move. And so that's the space where maybe we begin to sort of get into this possibility where comics become a 21st century object rather than a 19th century object. But the fact that they skipped the whole 20th century, right? Cinema has not, right? If you put Avengers Endgame in front of someone who was watching cinema in 1905, they would be like, how did you catch that big purple thing? How did you train it? And why is everything in color, right? Why is there sound, right? Comics don't function that way. They've since the 1890s, they've been more or less the same. And the internet could change that. Yeah.
Is there at all a story of expanding literacy with the form of these comics?
You know, that is a huge question, and I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. That's been sort of a traditional explanation for why comics suddenly become so popular in the 1890s, that all of a sudden a lot of the Eastern, Southern, and other kinds of sort of suspect European immigrants of suspect whiteness suddenly learn how to read English. And I think that that's a compelling possibility. And I think it's also a compelling possibility that the pictures, as happens with comic books now, helped people learn to read English. But I don't know that we have any good evidence one way or the other, although it's tempting to speculate. And certainly I think it's an interesting thesis. But I don't have a good answer for you either way. Yeah.
Are you going to look into the economics of comic strips, not necessarily newspaper or the syndication side, but the fact that comics were the only way that a cartoonist could become filthy rich, with the exception of Walt Disney.
Yeah.
And that's almost true from almost the very beginning.
Yeah. And in fact, the star system in cartooning exists long before the star system exists in cinema. And so cartoonists are making a lot of money, not now, but throughout the first half of the 20th century, and even getting into like the 1970s, they're making a ton of money through syndication. And so one of the reasons that cartooning suddenly becomes more popular as a practice also has to be understood as exactly the kind of economic thing that you're describing, right? I believe that there are all these technological reasons, all these cultural reasons, but also this form becomes very appealing to a lot of cartoonists very quickly. And I think that's a great point. Yeah.
Did I understand you to say that Topfer more or less wrote a comic book or a comic strip in 1846, and it just didn't catch on?
I mean,
does he meet all the criteria?
Yeah. I mean, look. I mean, I think that if Topfer invented the comic strip, that then we would have comic strips starting in the 1840s. I think that you can't just look at the form and say, oh, Topfer invented the comic strip. I think you need to look at culture, and I think you need to look at context, and I think you need to look at all these other things, and think about like what Topfer's role might have been in this, what Topfer's role might have been in this context. I'm also not interested in the first comic strip question. I don't think it's very interesting. I think that what we can see is things that look an awful lot like comic strips developing in the 19th century. You see them in the 18th century. There's this series of cartoons that emerge out of Pennsylvania as a result of massacre of a Native American community by some Scotch-Irish settlers in western Pennsylvania in the 1760s, that are organized in grids and that have word balloons and that have sequence. And so you see these things occur in sort of fits and starts across the sort of history of illustration. And so the moment that I'm interested in is less like when these things become possible to imagine and when they become possible to imagine for everyone. Right? I think Topfer was probably a genius. I think he could probably he could see the world in a way that nobody else could at that time. I might even use the word advanced to describe what he was doing. But I don't think that what we call the comic strip is only a formal thing. I think it's also a cultural thing, and I think it's also a generic thing. And I think that if we take those things into consideration, we can't call Topfer the inventor of the comic strip, and we can't call the translation of one of his pieces, which is titled in the United States, The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, which is a fabulous name, the first comic book in the United States. Now, with that said, I don't think that question is an interesting one. Like, what's the first comic book? What's the first comic strip? And I don't think it tells us anything. I think what's more interesting is to think about why the comic strip hits in the way that it hits at the end of the 19th century and why it continues through the 20th century and into the 21st century, despite like all these other related forms more or less disappearing. You know, only specialists look at magic lanterns now. They're fun, right? But cinema is way better, right? Same thing with moving panoramas. Same things with the kind of vaudeville forms that we're playing with time, like the tableau vivant. That stuff totally disappears. Or it remains, but only as sort of like art appropriated by specialists for fine art audiences. Whereas the comic strip exists across those kinds of cultural hierarchies. And why it persists, despite being a kind of 19th century concern, is a thing that I'm really interested in.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. And thank you all for coming.